The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Texas plains as Sarah Mitchell clutched her 6-month-old baby closer to her chest. The infant's weak cries had become barely audible whispers, and Sarah's heart broke with each labored breath her son took. 3 days had passed since little Thomas had eaten anything substantial, and Sarah's own milk had dried up weeks ago from malnutrition and stress. The small wooden cabin that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison. Her husband James had been dead for 2 months, killed by a rattlesnake while checking their meager cattle herd. Since then, everything had fallen apart. The few neighbors they had were struggling just as much, and the nearest town was 50 miles away through dangerous territory known for Comanche raids. Sarah walked to the kitchen window and stared at the barren landscape. Their small garden had withered in the drought, and the last of their preserved food had run out yesterday. She had already sold everything of value they owned to traveling merchants, including her wedding ring and James's pocket watch. All that remained were the clothes on their backs and the empty cabin that seemed to mock her desperation. Thomas stirred weakly in her arms, his tiny face pale and gaunt. Sarah had tried everything she could think of. She had attempted to make thin gruel from tree bark, but the baby couldn't keep it down. She had walked miles searching for wild berries or edible plants, but the harsh summer had left the land as barren as her hopes. The sound of approaching horses made Sarah freeze. Living alone on the frontier, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. She peered through the dusty window and saw a group of riders approaching through the heat shimmer. As they drew closer, her blood ran cold. The distinctive war paint and feathered hair ornaments were unmistakable. Comanche warriors. Sarah's hands trembled as she held Thomas tighter. She had heard countless stories of Comanche raids, of settlers killed or taken captive, but as she watched the approaching riders, something strange happened. Instead of the fear she expected to feel, a desperate idea began forming in her mind. The riders stopped about 30 yards from the cabin. Sarah counted 7 warriors, their horses stamping and snorting in the morning heat. The leader sat tall on a magnificent spotted horse, his presence commanding even at a distance. Sarah had never seen a Comanche warrior up close, but she could tell this man was important by the way the others deferred to him. For several minutes, neither side moved. Sarah knew they were aware of her presence. The smoke from her cooking fire yesterday would have been visible for miles, and Comanche were known for their tracking skills. But they weren't attacking or surrounding the cabin. They seemed to be waiting for something. Thomas let out a pitiful cry that seemed to echo across the silent plain. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to any reasonable person. She opened the cabin door and stepped outside, her baby cradled in her arms. The warriors immediately became alert, hands moving toward their weapons. But Sarah raised her free hand in what she hoped was a peaceful gesture and began walking slowly toward them. Her legs felt like water and her heart pounded so hard she was sure they could hear it. The tall leader held up his hand, and the other warriors relaxed slightly. Sarah could see him more clearly now. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his 30s, with intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation at once. Intricate tattoos covered his muscular arms, and eagle feathers adorned his long black hair. When Sarah was about 10 feet away, she stopped. The warrior studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her gaunt face to the obviously malnourished baby in her arms. Sarah could see something change in his expression, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, then louder. "Please, my baby is starving. This is all I have left." She gestured toward the empty cabin behind her, then looked down at Thomas, who had gone ominously quiet. The warrior said something in his own language to the others, then dismounted from his horse. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with violence, but there was no aggression in his approach. Instead, he seemed curious, almost cautious. He stopped just arm's length away from Sarah and spoke in accented but clear English. "You have no man?" Sarah shook her head, fighting back tears. "My husband died 2 months ago. Snake bite. I have no family, no help. My baby." She couldn't finish the sentence as Thomas's breathing became even more labored. The warrior's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance more carefully. Sarah knew she must look terrible. Her dress was patched and dirty. Her hair hung in unwashed tangles, and she had lost so much weight that her clothes hung loosely on her frame. But it was the baby's condition that seemed to hold his attention. "How long?" he asked simply. 3 days since he ate anything. My milk stopped weeks ago. Sarah's voice broke on the words. The warrior turned and spoke rapidly to his companions. Sarah caught none of the words, but she could hear the urgency in his tone. One of the younger warriors seemed to be arguing, gesturing toward Sarah with what looked like hostility. But the leader's response was sharp and final, clearly ending the debate. He turned back to Sarah and studied her face for a long moment. You would trust Comanche with your child's life? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah looked down at Thomas, whose lips were turning blue around the edges. She thought of all the stories she had heard, all the warnings about Comanche cruelty, but she also thought about her son dying in her arms while she did nothing. I would trust anyone who might save him, she answered honestly. The warrior nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied some test she hadn't known she was taking. He whistled sharply, and one of the other warriors rode forward, leading a horse with several bags hanging from its saddle. Come, the tall warrior said to Sarah. There is mare with foal in our camp. 2 days' ride. Mare lost foal yesterday. Still has milk? Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to hope. You would help us? Child should not die for father's bad luck, he replied matter-of-factly. But journey is hard. You too weak, maybe? Sarah looked down at Thomas again. His breathing was becoming more and more shallow. If we stay here, he dies anyway. The warrior seemed to approve of her logic. He turned and spoke to his men again, then looked back at Sarah. You ride with Strong Bear, he said, pointing to himself. Others watch for enemies. We leave now. As Sarah processed what was happening, she realized she was about to trust her life and her baby's life to a group of Comanche warriors. Everything she had ever been taught told her this was madness. But as she looked at Thomas's pale, still face, she knew she had no choice. The warrior named Strong Bear was already preparing his horse, adjusting the blankets and checking the stirrups. Sarah took one last look at the cabin that had been her home, knowing she might never see it again. Then she walked toward the horse, toward an uncertain future, toward the only hope her son had left. Strong Bear helped Sarah mount his horse, positioning her so she could hold Thomas securely while he controlled the reins from behind her. The sensation of being so close to the Comanche warrior made Sarah's heart race with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. His presence was overwhelming, yet she found herself oddly comforted by his steady breathing and the confident way he handled the horse. The group set off across the plains at a pace that was fast but not reckless. Strong Bear seemed to understand that Sarah was weak and the baby fragile. Every few minutes he would ask quietly, "Child breathes?" And Sarah would check Thomas and nod or shake her head accordingly. As they rode, Sarah caught glimpses of the other warriors. They were younger than Strong Bear, probably in their 20s, and they watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. One warrior in particular, with a jagged scar across his left cheek, kept shooting hostile looks in her direction. Sarah could tell he disagreed with Strong Bear's decision to help her. The sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive. Sarah's head began to swim from dehydration and exhaustion. She had eaten almost nothing in the past week, and the stress of Thomas's condition had left her physically and emotionally drained. Several times she felt herself swaying in the saddle, only to be steadied by Strong Bear's firm grip. "Drink," Strong Bear said during one of their brief stops, offering her a water skin made from animal hide. The water was warm but clean, and Sarah drank gratefully while trying to get a few drops into Thomas's mouth. The baby's lips were cracked and dry, and he barely responded to the moisture. "Is far to your camp?" Sarah asked as they prepared to continue riding. "Before sun sleeps again," Strong Bear replied. "Maybe child lives that long, maybe not. We see." His blunt honesty was somehow more comforting than false reassurance would have been. Sarah appreciated that he wasn't making promises he couldn't keep. She settled back against him as they resumed their journey, surprised to find that she was beginning to trust this man who should have been her enemy. During the long afternoon, Strong Bear began to talk. His English was better than Sarah had initially thought, though he chose his words carefully. He told her about the mare who had lost her foal. The horse had given birth 3 days ago, but the baby had been stillborn. The mare was grieving and still producing milk that would soon dry up if not used. "Why do you help us?" Sarah asked during one quiet stretch of riding. Strong Bear was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Finally he said, "I have son. 2 years old. If my woman died, if I was alone and child was dying, He paused. Someone should help. Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes. The idea that this feared Comanche warrior was also a father, someone who could understand her desperation, had never occurred to her. "What's your son's name?" "Running Wolf," Strong Bear answered, and Sarah could hear the pride in his voice.
"He is strong, like his grandfather." As the day wore on, Sarah learned more about the man who had become her unlikely savior.
Strong Bear was a war chief, responsible for leading raids and protecting his people. He had fought against white settlers many times, but he had also seen too much death and suffering. The loss of children, whether Comanche or white, was something that troubled him deeply. "My people have old law," he explained as they crested a low hill.
"Child in need is everyone's child."
"Color of skin not matter to hungry baby." Thomas stirred weakly in Sarah's arms, letting out a soft whimper that barely qualified as a cry. Sarah checked his breathing and was relieved to find it still steady, though shallow. She began to talk to him softly, telling him about the mare they were going to meet, about how he would soon have milk to drink. One of the younger warriors, the one with the scar, rode up alongside them and spoke rapidly to Strong Bear in their language. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly argumentative. Strong Bear's response was sharp and final, causing the scarred warrior to fall back with obvious displeasure. "What did he say?" Sarah asked. "Spotted Hawk thinks bringing white woman to camp is dangerous. He thinks soldiers might follow." Sarah felt a chill of fear. She hadn't considered that helping her might put Strong Bear's people at risk. "Would they follow us, I mean?" Strong Bear shrugged. "No soldiers know you missing yet, and if they come, we deal with them." His casual confidence about facing U.S. soldiers reminded Sarah exactly who she was traveling with. These men were warriors who had spent their lives fighting against people like her. Yet here she was, trusting one of them with her most precious possession. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, Sarah began to feel dizzy and nauseous. The combination of heat, dehydration, and her own malnourishment was taking its toll. She tried to hide her weakness, but Strong Bear noticed immediately when she began to sway in the saddle. "You need food," he observed, slowing his horse. "I'm fine," Sarah protested weakly. Strong Bear called a halt and helped Sarah down from the horse. Her legs buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if he hadn't caught her arm. The other warriors gathered around, their expressions concerned despite their earlier skepticism. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, produced a piece of dried meat from his pouch. He offered it to Sarah with a shy smile. She accepted it gratefully, though her stomach rebelled at first. She forced herself to chew and swallow, knowing she needed strength for whatever lay ahead. While Sarah ate, Strong Bear examined Thomas more closely. The baby's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Strong Bear's expression grew grave as he gently touched the child's forehead. "Is very weak," he said quietly to Sarah. "We must ride faster, even if dangerous for you." Sarah nodded, understanding the stakes. If they continued at their current pace to protect her health, Thomas might die before they reached help. But if they rode harder, she might not be able to stay conscious in the saddle. "I can manage," she said, struggling to her feet. "Do whatever you think is best." Strong Bear studied her face for a moment, then nodded. He spoke to his warriors in their language, and Sarah could tell he was explaining the change in plans. There was some discussion, but no real argument this time. Even Spotted Hawk seemed to understand the urgency. They remounted and set off again, this time at a considerably faster pace. Sarah gritted her teeth and held on, her arms aching from clutching Thomas while trying to maintain her balance. The landscape blurred past them as they raced across the plains, the horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah caught sight of smoke rising in the distance. Strong Bear followed her gaze and nodded. "Camp," he said simply. "We almost there." Sarah looked down at Thomas, who had been ominously still for the past hour. In the fading light, she could barely detect the rise and fall of his tiny chest. They were so close now, but would they be close enough? The next few miles seemed to take forever, even at their increased pace. Sarah found herself praying to every god she could think of, begging for just a little more time. As they finally approached the camp, she could see figures moving between the scattered teepees. Alerted by the sound of approaching horses, Strong Bear called out something in his language, and Sarah heard answering calls from the camp. She realized he was announcing their arrival, probably explaining the unusual circumstances that had brought a white woman and her baby into their midst. As they rode into the camp proper, Sarah was struck by how normal everything looked. Children played around the fires, women worked on various tasks, and men sat in groups talking. It could have been any frontier settlement except for the distinctive cone-shaped dwellings and the obvious Native American dress and customs. People gathered to stare at the unusual visitors, their faces showing everything from curiosity to concern to outright hostility. Sarah clutched Thomas tighter, suddenly very aware that she was completely at the mercy of these people who had every reason to hate someone like her, Strong. Bear brought his horse to a stop near the center of the camp and began speaking rapidly to the assembled crowd. Sarah caught occasional English words mixed in with the flowing Comanche language, and she realized he was explaining their situation and asking for help. An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face grave as she looked at Thomas. She spoke to Strong Bear, gesturing toward one of the larger teepees. Strong Bear nodded and helped Sarah down from the horse. "Medicine woman will look at child," he explained, "and we find mare for milk." As Sarah followed the elderly woman toward the teepee, she realized that her fate and Thomas's were now completely in the hands of people she had been taught to fear and distrust. But as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, she saw something she hadn't expected to find in a Comanche camp: compassion. The elderly medicine woman, who Strong Bear introduced as Grandmother Willow, led Sarah into a spacious teepee decorated with intricate paintings and filled with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the wooden poles. The smell of sage and other medicinal plants filled the air, creating an atmosphere that was both foreign and oddly comforting to Sarah. Grandmother Willow gestured for Sarah to sit on a pile of soft buffalo robes near the center fire. Her movements were deliberate and gentle as she examined Thomas, her weathered hands surprisingly tender as she checked his breathing, felt his pulse, and looked into his eyes. She spoke in Comanche to Strong Bear, who had followed them inside, and Sarah could tell from their tone that they were discussing Thomas's condition. "She says child is very close to death," Strong Bear translated grimly. "But maybe not too late if we act fast." Grandmother Willow called out toward the teepee entrance, and within moments a younger woman appeared carrying a gourd filled with a pale liquid. The older woman took it and brought it to Sarah, gesturing for her to try feeding it to Thomas. "Mare's milk," Strong Bear explained. "Fresh from horse that lost foal yesterday." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the gourd. This was the moment she had been hoping for since their journey began. She carefully lifted Thomas and tried to get him to take some of the milk, but his lips barely parted and he showed no interest in drinking. Grandmother Willow watched for a moment, then gently took Thomas from Sarah's arms. She demonstrated a technique for feeding weak babies, using her finger to drip tiny amounts of milk into his mouth while massaging his throat to encourage swallowing. After several attempts, Thomas showed the faintest sign of response, his tongue moving slightly as a few drops went down. For the next hour, the three adults worked together to get precious nutrients into the dying baby. Drop by drop, with infinite patience, they managed to get nearly half the gourd's contents into Thomas. Sarah watched with growing hope as a tiny bit of color seemed to return to his pale cheeks. "Good," Grandmother Willow said in accented English, one of the few English words she knew. She smiled at Sarah and patted her hand reassuringly. Strong Bear translated more of what the medicine woman was saying. "She says you did right thing bringing him here. Few more hours and would be too late. She wants to know when you last ate real food." Sarah had to think about it. 4 days ago, I think. Maybe 5. I gave everything to Thomas, but he couldn't keep it down. Strong Bear spoke to Grandmother Willow, who immediately began preparing something else. She mixed various dried herbs and roots with water, creating a broth that smelled earthy but not unpleasant. She handed it to Sarah with clear instructions to drink all of it. As Sarah sipped the warm broth, she felt strength beginning to return to her body. The medicine woman's knowledge was clearly extensive, and Sarah found herself thinking that this elderly Comanche woman probably knew more about healing than any doctor she had ever met. Outside the teepee, Sarah could hear the sounds of camp life continuing around them. Children laughed and played, women called to each other as they worked, and men discussed the day's events. Occasionally, she heard her name mentioned in conversations, always in conjunction with words she didn't understand but could guess were related to her unusual presence in their camp. "What are they saying about me?" Sarah asked Strong Bear as Grandmother Willow stepped outside to get more supplies. Strong Bear considered his answer carefully. "Some are curious. Some are worried. Some are angry that I brought White Woman here. Are you sorry you helped us?" He looked at Thomas, who was sleeping more peacefully than he had in days, then back at Sarah. "No, but decisions have consequences. Some of my people think I am too soft with whites." Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't considered that Strong Bear might face criticism or worse for helping her. "I don't want to cause trouble for you." "Trouble finds Strong Bear anyway," he replied with what might have been a smile. "This trouble has good reason." Grandmother Willow returned with more mare's milk and a selection of roots and berries. She began preparing another feeding for Thomas while explaining something to Strong Bear in rapid Comanche. Whatever she was saying seemed important, and Strong Bear's expression grew serious as he listened. "She says child will need to feed every hour for next day, maybe 2 days," he translated, "and you must eat to make your own milk return. She has herbs that will help." "How long can we stay?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing that she had no idea what the long-term plan was. She couldn't stay in a Comanche camp indefinitely, but Thomas wasn't strong enough to travel yet either. "Until child is strong enough," Strong Bear answered simply. "Then we decide what comes next." As if summoned by their conversation, Spotted Hawk appeared at the teepee entrance. He spoke urgently to Strong Bear, gesturing toward the edge of camp. Sarah could tell from his tone and body language that something was wrong. Strong Bear's expression hardened as he listened. He replied sharply to Spotted Hawk, who responded with what sounded like an argument. Finally, Strong Bear stood and turned to Sarah. "Riders coming from east. Maybe soldiers, maybe settlers looking for you. Spotted Hawk wants to leave now. Take you away from camp so they don't find us." Sarah felt her heart sink. "How far away are they?" "Few hours, maybe less. But child cannot travel yet." Sarah looked down at Thomas, who had just finished another small feeding and was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Moving him now could kill him, but staying might endanger the entire camp. "What do you think I should do?" she asked Strong Bear. Before he could answer, Grandmother Willow spoke up. She had obviously understood enough of the conversation to know what was happening. She looked directly at Sarah and spoke in careful English. "Child stays. Child lives here now if needs to." Sarah stared at the elderly woman, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You would keep him? Raise him as your own?" Grandmother Willow nodded firmly and spoke more in Comanche to Strong Bear, who translated. "She says she lost grandchild last winter to sickness. She has milk mother and love to give. Child would be safe here, would grow strong." The offer was both generous and heartbreaking. Sarah could see the logic in it. Thomas would have constant care, adequate food, and protection from whatever dangers awaited them outside the camp. But the idea of leaving her son behind felt like tearing her heart out. Strong Bear seemed to read her thoughts. "You could stay too," he said quietly. "Some white women have joined our people before. But life is very different here." Very hard. Sarah thought about what that would mean. She would have to give up everything she had ever known, every aspect of her former life. She would be completely dependent on the goodwill of people who had every reason to hate her. But she would be with Thomas and he would be safe. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Spotted Hawk called out something urgent, and Strong Bear immediately moved to the teepee entrance to look outside. When he turned back, his expression was grim. "Soldiers. 10, maybe 12. They will be here soon." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. If the soldiers found her here, they would assume she had been kidnapped. They might attack the camp, and innocent people could be killed because of her presence. "I have to go with them," she said, reaching for Thomas. But Grandmother Willow gently but firmly blocked her path to the baby. She spoke rapidly to Strong Bear, her tone brooking no argument. "She says child stays," Strong Bear translated. "Too weak to travel. Soldiers will not take good care of baby." Sarah realized that the elderly woman was right. Even if the soldiers meant well, they had no way to properly care for a sick infant on the trail. Thomas was finally getting the specialized attention he needed to survive. The sound of horses was getting closer. Strong Bear made a quick decision. "You come with me. We meet soldiers outside camp. You tell them you escaped, that you and child were never here. But what about Thomas? Grandmother Willow hides him until soldiers gone. Then we decide." It was a desperate plan, but it might work. Sarah leaned down and kissed Thomas's forehead, whispering a promise that she would come back for him somehow. Then she followed Strong Bear out of the teepee and toward what might be the most difficult conversation of her life. As they walked through the camp toward the approaching soldiers, Sarah noticed how quickly and efficiently the Comanche were concealing any evidence of her presence. Children and women disappeared into teepees. Men armed themselves discreetly, and a few warriors mounted horses to flank the soldiers if needed. Strong Bear walked beside her with the confidence of a man who had faced danger many times before. "Remember," he said quietly, "you escaped from raiders. You walked for days. You saw our camp and came for help, but we just found you." Sarah nodded, trying to prepare herself for the lies she would have to tell. In the distance, she could see the dust cloud raised by the approaching soldiers getting closer. Soon she would have to choose between her old life and her son's survival, and she wasn't sure she was ready for either option. The approaching soldiers were led by a stern-faced captain with graying hair and hard eyes that had seen too much frontier violence. Behind him rode 11 enlisted men, their uniforms dusty from hard travel and their hands resting casually on their weapons. Sarah recognized the look in their eyes. They expected trouble and were prepared to deal with it harshly. Strong Bear walked forward to meet them, his posture confident but not threatening. Sarah followed a few steps behind, her heart pounding as she prepared to deliver the performance of her life. Everything depended on convincing these soldiers that she had been wandering alone and had never brought a baby into the camp. Captain Morrison, the officer, introduced himself curtly, his gaze moving suspiciously between Strong Bear and Sarah. "We're looking for a woman named Sarah Mitchell. White woman, traveling with an infant. You seen anyone like that?" Sarah stepped forward before Strong Bear could answer. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "These people just found me about an hour ago." Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her appearance. Sarah knew she looked terrible, gaunt, dirty, and exhausted, which actually helped support her story of wandering alone for days. "Where's your baby?" Morrison asked bluntly. Sarah had prepared for this question, but it still hit her like a physical blow. "Dead," she whispered, letting real grief show in her voice. 3 days ago, I couldn't save him." The lie felt like poison in her mouth, but she forced herself to continue. "I buried him myself about 10 miles east of here, under a cottonwood tree by a dry creek bed." Morrison's expression softened slightly but remained suspicious. "We heard reports of Comanche raiders in your area. What happened to your husband?" "Snakebite 2 months ago," Sarah answered truthfully. "After James died, I tried to manage alone. But when Thomas got sick," she let her voice trail off, as if the memory was too painful to continue. Strong Bear spoke for the first time, his English careful and formal. "Woman came to our camp asking for water. She was very weak, nearly dead. We gave her food and water, but baby was already gone." One of the younger soldiers spoke up. "Captain, maybe we should search the camp. Make sure they're not hiding anything." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. If they searched the camp and found Thomas, not only would her story fall apart, but the soldiers might assume the worst about how he had ended up there. Strong Bear's expression didn't change, but Sarah could sense the tension in his body. "You are welcome to look," he said calmly, "but you will find only Comanche families. No white babies." Captain Morrison considered this for a long moment. Sarah could tell he was weighing the diplomatic implications of searching a peaceful Comanche camp without clear evidence of wrongdoing. Relations between the army and various tribes were always delicate, and an unnecessary provocation could lead to retaliation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison said finally, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." Sarah took a deep breath and began weaving her story. She told him about James's death, about struggling alone with Thomas, about the baby getting sick and gradually weakening. Despite her desperate efforts to save him, she described burying her son with her own hands, then wandering aimlessly across the plains in a grief-stricken daze until the Comanche found her. As she spoke, Sarah was surprised by how easily the lies came. Perhaps it was because parts of the story were true. Thomas had been dying, she had been desperate, and she was indeed grief-stricken. The only difference was the ending she was describing versus the one she prayed was actually happening. "Why didn't you come to Fort Davis for help?" Morrison asked. "It's only 2 days' ride from your place." "I didn't know if Thomas could survive the trip," Sarah replied. and by the time I realized how serious it was, he was too weak to travel. I thought I could save him myself. Morrison nodded slowly. It was a believable story, and Sarah could see that he was starting to accept it. But then one of his sergeants rode up and whispered something in his ear. Morrison's expression hardened again. "Sergeant Williams says he heard a baby crying from somewhere in the camp," Morrison announced, watching Sarah's face carefully for any reaction. Sarah felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Comanche babies cry too, Captain," she said quietly. "Just like white babies do," Strong Bear spoke up smoothly. "My nephew's wife had baby 2 weeks ago. Child cries much, keeps whole camp awake sometimes." Morrison looked between them, clearly trying to decide whether to believe their explanation. Sarah held her breath, knowing that everything hung in the balance of this moment. Finally, Morrison made his decision. "Sergeant Williams, take 3 men and do a quick sweep of the camp. Look for any signs of white settlers or their belongings. But be respectful, these people are cooperating with us." Sarah's heart sank, but Strong Bear remained calm. "Of course," he said. "But please tell your men to be gentle with the children and women. Some are frightened by soldiers." As the search party prepared to enter the camp, Sarah caught a glimpse of Spotted Hawk in the distance. The scarred warrior was watching the proceedings with obvious anger, and Sarah realized that her presence was creating exactly the kind of conflict he had warned against. The soldiers moved through the camp methodically but respectfully, checking the larger teepees and looking for anything that might indicate the presence of white captives. Sarah watched nervously, knowing that somewhere in the camp Grandmother Willow was hiding Thomas. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Sergeant Williams returned to Captain Morrison. "Nothing, sir," he reported. "Just families going about their normal business. We did hear a baby crying, but it was definitely in one of the teepees with a Comanche woman and her husband." Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense she almost collapsed. Somehow Grandmother Willow had managed to keep Thomas hidden, while making it seem like the crying came from a different teepee entirely. Morrison studied Sarah's face one more time. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally. "We'll escort you back to Fort Davis. You can't stay out here alone." "Actually," Sarah said, thinking quickly, "I was hoping to travel to San Antonio. I have a sister there who might take me in." Morrison frowned. "That's a long journey for a woman alone. And dangerous." Strong Bear stepped forward again. "My people trade in San Antonio sometimes. Next group goes in 1 week. Woman could travel with them if she wants. Would be safer than going alone." Sarah held her breath, hoping Morrison would accept this arrangement. It would give her time to figure out what to do about Thomas, and it would get the soldiers away from the camp. Morrison considered this proposal. "You'd trust these Indians to get you there safely?" "They've been kind to me so far," Sarah replied truthfully. "And I don't have much choice." After a few more minutes of discussion, Morrison agreed to the plan. The soldiers would return to Fort Davis and report that they had found Sarah alive, but that her baby had died. She would travel to San Antonio with the next Comanche trading party. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Morrison approached Sarah one last time. "Ma'am, I want you to know that if these people give you any trouble, or if you change your mind about going to San Antonio, you can always come to Fort Davis. We'll help you get back on your feet." "Thank you, Captain," Sarah replied. "I appreciate everything you've done." After the soldiers rode away, Sarah found herself standing alone with Strong Bear in the middle of the camp. The other Comanche gradually emerged from their teepees, and Sarah could see a mixture of relief and curiosity in their faces. "That was well done," Strong Bear said quietly. "But now we have bigger problem." "What do you mean?" "Now everyone thinks your child is dead. If you take him back to White World, people will ask questions. And if you stay here," he gestured around the camp, "you become Comanche." Sarah stared at Strong Bear as the full weight of her situation became clear. She had successfully protected Thomas and the camp from immediate danger, but in doing so, she had created an impossible dilemma. According to everyone who mattered in the White World, her son was dead. Taking him back now would raise questions she couldn't answer without exposing the Comanche who had saved his life. "Can I see him?" she asked quietly. Strong Bear nodded and led her back to Grandmother Willow's teepee. Inside, they found the elderly woman sitting peacefully beside Thomas, who was sleeping soundly after another feeding. His color had improved dramatically, and his breathing was steady and strong. For the first time in weeks, he looked like a healthy baby instead of a dying one. Grandmother Willow looked up as they entered and spoke softly to Strong Bear. He listened, then turned to Sarah with a slight smile. She says child took full feeding this time. No problems keeping milk down. She thinks he will be strong again in a few days. Sarah knelt beside Thomas and gently touched his cheek. He stirred at her touch but didn't wake, simply settling more comfortably into the soft buffalo robes. The sight of him looking so peaceful filled her with both joy and anguish. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Grandmother Willow seemed to understand her distress without needing translation. The elderly woman began speaking in Comanche, her voice gentle but firm. Strong Bear listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or making comments. "She has idea," Strong Bear finally said, "but is not easy choice for you. Tell me." "Grandmother Willow says you can stay here until child is grown. Live as Comanche woman, learn our ways. When child is old enough, maybe 15 or 16 years, you both can decide if you want to go back to White World." Sarah considered this possibility. 15 years living among the Comanche, raising Thomas in a culture completely different from her own. By the time he was old enough to make his own choice, he would essentially be Comanche himself. "What would that mean for me?" she asked.
"How would I live here?"
Strong Bear sat down across from her, his expression serious. "You would need to learn our language, our customs, our ways of surviving. Grandmother Willow would teach you about healing plants and women's work. You would help with hunting, gathering, preparing food. It is hard life, but good life for those who accept it. And Thomas, he would be raised as Comanche boy. Learn to ride, to hunt, to be warrior, but also learn about White World from you. When time comes, he could choose which world he wants to live in." Sarah looked around the teepee, taking in the alien yet somehow welcoming environment. The painted walls told stories she couldn't read. The hanging herbs filled the air with unfamiliar scents, and the whole space felt both foreign and oddly homelike. "What about you?" she asked Strong Bear. How would this work?" Strong Bear was quiet for a long moment. "Grandmother Willow suggests that you become my second wife," he said finally. "It is not uncommon for war chief to have 2 wives, especially if first wife agrees. Would give you protection and status in tribe." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. The idea of marrying Strong Bear, of sharing him with another woman, was something she had never considered. Yet she could see the practical wisdom in it. A single white woman in a Comanche camp would be vulnerable, but the wife of a war chief would be respected and protected. "Your first wife would agree to this?" Morningstar is practical woman. She knows that taking care of you and child would be better than letting you leave and possibly bring soldiers back. Also, she lost baby last year. Having child in teepee might help her heal. As if summoned by their conversation, a woman appeared at the teepee entrance. She was younger than Sarah, probably in her mid-20s, with long black hair adorned with small beads and feathers. Her face was strikingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that reminded Sarah of Strong Bear's. Strong Bear spoke to the woman in Comanche, clearly explaining the situation and the proposed arrangement. The woman, who Sarah assumed was Morningstar, listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Sarah and Thomas. When Strong Bear finished speaking, she approached Sarah and knelt beside the baby. Morningstar gently touched Thomas's face, and her expression softened considerably. She spoke to Strong Bear, who translated. "She says child is beautiful and strong. She thinks Grandmother Willow's plan is wise, but she wants to know if you are willing to work hard and learn Comanche ways properly." Sarah looked directly at Morningstar and tried to convey her sincerity through her expression and tone. "Tell her I will do whatever is necessary to protect my son. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I want to learn." Morningstar seemed to understand the gist of Sarah's words even before Strong Bear translated. She nodded approvingly and spoke again. "She says you can share our teepee until you learn enough to have your own. She will teach you women's work and help care for child. But you must understand that Strong Bear is her husband first. You would be second wife, with different duties and different place." The arrangement was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined for her life. But she could see that it offered Thomas the best chance for survival and growth. More than that, she was beginning to see that these people, despite being her supposed enemies, were offering her and her son something precious, a family and a community. "There's one more thing," Strong Bear said. "If you choose this path, you cannot change your mind easily. Leaving later would be dangerous for all of us, and you would have to let your old life die completely. No contact with white world until child is grown. Sarah thought about her empty cabin, her dead husband, her complete lack of family or prospects in the white world. What was she really giving up? A life of poverty and struggle, probably ending in starvation or worse. Here she would have protection, purpose, and most importantly, Thomas would have a chance to grow up strong and healthy. "Can I have some time to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Strong Bear replied, "but not too much time. Other warriors are nervous about keeping white woman in camp. Decision must be made soon." That evening, Sarah sat outside Grandmother Willow's teepee, holding Thomas while watching the camp's evening activities. Children played games around the fires, women prepared food and worked on various crafts, and men sat in groups discussing the day's events. It was a peaceful, family-oriented scene that reminded her of the community she had lost when James died. Spotted Hawk approached her as the sun was setting, his scarred face serious but not hostile. He spoke in halting English, clearly making an effort to communicate with her directly. "Strong Bear is good man," he said slowly, "but helping you makes danger for all. You understand?" Sarah nodded. "I understand. I don't want to bring danger to your people." Spotted Hawk studied her face for a moment. "If you stay, you must be Comanche completely. No looking back to white world. No regrets. Can you do this?" Sarah looked down at Thomas, who was contentedly nursing from a bottle made from an animal bladder, filled with mare's milk. His recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, and she knew it was entirely due to the kindness and knowledge of these people. "For my son," she said quietly, "I can do anything." Spotted Hawk seemed satisfied with her answer. He nodded once and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her sleeping baby. As the stars appeared overhead and the camp settled into peaceful quiet, Sarah made her decision. She would accept Grandmother Willow's proposal. She would become Morningstar's sister wife, learn Comanche ways, and raise Thomas as a child of two worlds. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life that would give her son the best chance for happiness and survival. Tomorrow, she would tell Strong Bear of her choice and begin the transformation from Sarah Mitchell, desperate widow, to whatever name they would give her as a Comanche woman. Tonight, she simply held her son and watched the stars, grateful beyond words for the unexpected salvation they had found in the most unlikely place. Captain Morrison arrived at the camp 3 days later, accompanied by 2 civilian men Sarah didn't recognize, and a grizzled frontier scout whose weathered face spoke of decades spent tracking across dangerous territory. This time Morrison's demeanor was different, more suspicious, more determined, and decidedly less diplomatic than during his previous visit. Sarah, now called She Who Walks Between Worlds, watched from inside Morningstar's teepee as the 4 men approached the camp. Thomas, now a robust 1-year-old with chubby cheeks and bright, curious eyes, played contentedly at her feet with wooden toys carved by various members of the tribe. The sight of him so healthy and happy strengthened her resolve to protect their new life at any cost. Strong Bear met the visitors at the edge of camp, his bearing dignified but wary. Sarah could hear the conversation from her hiding place, and what she heard made her stomach clench with fear. "Chief," Morrison began formally, "I'm sorry to disturb your people again, but we've received some disturbing information about the woman we found here last year." "What information?" Strong Bear asked calmly. One of the civilian men stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with the pinched look of a man who rarely smiled. "Name's Jeremiah Fletcher," he introduced himself. "I'm Sarah Mitchell's brother-in-law. James Mitchell was my younger brother." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She had never met Jeremiah Fletcher, but James had mentioned his older brother occasionally, usually to complain, about his judgmental attitude and his belief that James had made a mistake settling so far from civilization. "I came down from Kansas when I heard about the deaths," Fletcher continued. "Something about the whole story doesn't sit right with me. I went to Sarah's cabin and I found some things that don't match up with what she told you." Morrison nodded grimly. Mr. Fletcher found evidence that suggests Mrs. Mitchell might not have been entirely truthful about what happened to her and her child. Strong Bear's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "What evidence?" Fletcher pulled a small bundle from his saddlebag and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a tiny knitted cap that Sarah recognized immediately. She had made it for Thomas during the cold months before James died. "Found this buried in a wooden box behind the cabin. Fletcher announced, along with some other baby clothes and a diary. According to Sarah's own writing, the baby was alive and healthy when she supposedly buried him. The dates don't match up with her story about him dying 3 days before you found her. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the box she had hastily buried before leaving the cabin with Strong Bear. She had hoped it would never be found. But Fletcher's determination to uncover the truth had led him to search more thoroughly than she had anticipated. Morrison's voice was stern as he continued the interrogation. Mr. Fletcher also found evidence that someone else had been at the cabin recently, horse tracks that didn't match Mrs. Mitchell's old mare, and signs that someone had helped her pack supplies. The scout, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was gravelly from years of shouting over prairie winds. Tracks led this direction, Captain. Multiple horses, including some unshod ponies. Definitely Indian horses. Strong Bear remained calm, but Sarah could see that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. If Morrison decided to search the camp thoroughly this time, Thomas would be discovered and the consequences could be catastrophic for everyone involved. You think white woman lied about child being dead? Strong Bear asked. I think, Morrison replied carefully, that Mrs. Mitchell might have been desperate enough to make some kind of arrangement with your people, and I think that arrangement might have involved her child. Fletcher's voice rose with indignation. That baby is my blood, my brother's son. If he's alive, he belongs with family, not with savages. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah saw several Comanche warriors stiffen at the word savages, and she knew that the situation was on the verge of turning violent. Strong Bear's response was measured but cold. Mr. Fletcher, you are guest in our camp. We have welcomed you and answered your questions. But if you cannot speak with respect, you should leave. Morrison quickly intervened before the confrontation could escalate. Chief, I'm going to have to ask permission to search your camp again. More thoroughly this time, and if I refuse, then I'll have to conclude that you're hiding something, and I'll return with enough soldiers to tear this place apart looking for it. The threat was clear, and Sarah knew that Strong Bear was trapped. If he refused the search, Morrison would bring overwhelming force that could destroy the entire community. If he allowed the search, Thomas would almost certainly be discovered. From her hiding place, Sarah made a decision that terrified her, but seemed to be the only option left. She picked up Thomas and stepped out of the teepee, walking slowly toward the group of men. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Fletcher's eyes widened in shock. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, and the scout let out a low whistle of surprise. Hello, Jeremiah, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Fletcher stared at her in confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman before him with his memories of his brother's wife. Sarah's transformation was complete. Her skin was tanned from constant outdoor work. Her hair was braided in the Comanche style and adorned with beads and feathers, and her clothes were entirely native in design and construction. Sarah? Fletcher managed to stammer. What have they done to you? They saved my life, Sarah replied simply. And they saved Thomas's life. Morrison stepped forward, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. Mrs. Mitchell, we thought you were... Why did you lie to us? Why did you tell us your baby was dead? Sarah looked down at Thomas, who was staring curiously at the strangers but showing no fear. In his world, surrounded by loving adults and other children, unexpected visitors were just another interesting development. Because he was dying, Sarah answered honestly. When you found me, Thomas had maybe hours left to live. These people had medicine and knowledge that saved him. By the time he was strong enough to travel, I realized that he had a better life here than anything I could give him in the white world. Fletcher's face was red with outrage. Better life? Living with savages? Learning heathen ways? Sarah, have you lost your mind? I've found my family, Sarah replied firmly. Thomas has parents who love him, a community that cares for him, and a future full of possibilities. What would you have given him, Jeremiah? A life working your farm in Kansas? The constant struggle against poverty and loneliness that killed your brother? Morrison looked between Sarah and Fletcher, clearly trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected development. Mrs. Mitchell, you can't just decide to abandon civilization and join an Indian tribe. It's not natural. Sarah shifted Thomas to her other hip and looked Morrison directly in the eye. Captain, a year ago I was a starving widow with a dying baby and no prospects except slow starvation or worse. Today I'm a valued member of a community, with skills I never dreamed of having and a son who's growing up strong and healthy. Which life sounds more natural to you? The conversation continued for another hour, with Fletcher demanding that Sarah return to Kansas with Thomas, Morrison trying to understand the legal implications of the situation, and Strongbear patiently defending Sarah's right to make her own choices. Finally, after much heated discussion, Morrison reached a decision. Mrs. Mitchell, I can't force you to leave if you don't want to, and I can see that your son is well cared for. But I have to ask you directly, are you here of your own free will? Have these people threatened you or coerced you in any way? I'm here because I choose to be, Sarah answered without hesitation. These people saved my life and my son's life when no one else would help us. They've treated us with kindness and respect. They've given us a home and a family. I'm not a captive, Captain. I'm a Comanche woman now. Fletcher made one last desperate appeal. Sarah, think about what you're doing. Think about James. Would he want his son raised as an Indian? Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. James wanted his son to live, Jeremiah. Above everything else, he wanted Thomas to grow up strong and healthy and loved. That's exactly what's happening here. In the end, Morrison and his party left empty-handed. Fletcher departed with bitter words about Sarah's betrayal of her own race. But there was nothing legally he could do to force her to leave or to take Thomas away from her. As the dust settled behind the departing riders, Sarah stood with Strongbear and Morning Star, watching Thomas play with the other children around the evening fires. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew that their secret was no longer safe. Too many people now knew the truth about her survival and Thomas's existence. What happens now? She asked Strongbear. Now we move camp, he replied. Find new place where white men won't think to look for us. Maybe farther west or south toward Mexico. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was the price of the choice she had made. They would always be looking over their shoulders, always ready to move if discovery threatened their community. But as she watched Thomas laughing with his Comanche siblings, as she felt the warmth of the family that had embraced them both, Sarah knew she had made the right decision. Her son would grow up knowing love, security, and the skills to survive in a harsh world. He would be a bridge between two cultures, carrying the best of both worlds into whatever future awaited him. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to understand the full story of how he came to live among the Comanche, he would ask Sarah if she ever regretted her choice. Looking at the strong, confident young man he had become, she would answer without hesitation that she had never regretted it for a single day. The desperate widow who had begged a Comanche warrior to save her starving baby had found something she never expected. A home where love transcended the boundaries of race and culture, where a dying child could grow into a proud young man who belonged fully to both worlds that had shaped him.